Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. So, in any case, so Martin Luther King, who used, I don't know if anybody's ever seen the movie Selma. It's a fantastic movie, by the way, and it chronicles some of the behind the scenes things that Dr. King did during the civil rights era, and some of the things that he did there. It was fascinating. It's actually really fascinating. What he would do is typically he would go and he would identify an area that had a particularly racist sort of government, whether it be a sheriff or prosecutors or judges in that area. And he would identify the hot spots, the worst. There were many bad places there, but he would identify the worst, who were the worst of the worst. And he would go to that area, and he would organize with people. He'd get everybody together, and he'd say, "Look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a demonstration. It's going to be a peaceful demonstration, and we're going to go. We're going to march, or we're going to have a sit-in, or we're going to have a protest, or whatever. We're going to do it by the book, right? We're going to do it by the letter of the law. We're not going to cause any harm toward anybody." And then what inevitably will happen, and what inevitably did happen in many of the cases, is that whenever Dr. King and and the people who were helping him, whenever they got involved in a protest, they would go out there and they would protest, and inevitably some of the local officials who were particularly racist individuals would come and attack him and his people and his followers, and they would harass them, and they would beat them, and they would enact violence on him. And guess what? The TV cameras followed Dr. King around, and so all of this was getting captured on camera. All of this was being played on the 6 o'clock news across everywhere in the United States, and people got to see a firsthand account of how racism, what it meant in the United States South. As he did this, then he began to engender the compassion of the nation. People began to see the plight of black people in the South, and how horrible racism and Jim Crow laws had diminished their rights and even their status as human beings. And tremendous support started coming in as a result of this. But notice how it happened. Dr. King didn't do anything violent, didn't even throw a punch to fight back, and told his people to do the same. Like the thing that you need to be willing to do is take a whooping. But if you can do that, and if you can put that all over the 6 o'clock news, then people begin to wake up to the injustice that is going on right in their very own land. And of course, that all culminated in the Civil Rights Act, and much was accomplished through it. Now, that's not to say that we're totally better, or totally cured from that, but much was accomplished through the tactics of nonviolence. And so maybe pacifists have a point, because the nonviolence of Dr. King accomplished more than sort of the realistic methods employed by one of his contemporaries, Malcolm X. Malcolm X said, by all means necessary, and yet when he rose up in force, he was met with force. When Dr. King did so in a nonviolent way, much more was accomplished. Public opinion was swayed much more quickly than it ever would have been under Malcolm X. In the telltale truth of that, the tacit implication of that is that Malcolm X himself sort of eased up on his methods toward the end of his life, and that's why he was assassinated in all likelihood there. But that's pacifism, that we don't, because human life is so important, because it's so valuable, we never recourse to violence in order to accomplish our objective. What we need to do is make use of nonviolent methods and nonviolent means of doing that. Now, there is a problem here at this point with pacifism, and that's not because we don't like it, or not because it seems to be sort of a wimpy thing to do. It really, in many ways, takes very much presence of mind and very much self-control to be able to do it. But there is a logical objection to pacifism that we need to understand before we it can be agreed that pacifism is the way to go. And the logical problem with pacifism is this: one might ask that if human life is so valuable and so precious, which is what the pacifist asserts, then why not use means to protect it, to preserve it? Means, not only nonviolent means, although that should be our first recourse, but would it not stand to reason that we should be able to use recourse even to violence in order to protect human life, if it is in fact so valuable? I mean, consider the following. Consider yourself and 10 friends are on a bus, and you and 10 friends are on your way somewhere, and another person boards the bus, and this person is a maniac, and this person is wielding a weapon, and he says that his intention is to kill everybody on the bus. Now, if you're a pacifist and you're committed to nonviolence, you might start reasoning with him, and you might start trying to tell him, to convince him to change his life and make a change for the better, and all this stuff, and that would be all commendable. But at the end of the day, if he is committed to harming people, then what's going to happen is that we're going to end up with 10 people dead in the bus, well, maybe 11 if we're including the driver, and one maniac who's on the loose to go and hurt more people. Would it not be more consistent with the premise that human life is valuable, says the critic of pacifism, would it not be more consistent with the premise that human life is valuable if, after trying to talk to this person, talking some sense into them, and they are intent on harming or killing everybody on that bus, if we use violent means to subdue him? That doesn't mean kill him. That means maybe hit him with a baseball bat and knock him out and tie him up. That means put him down and make sure that he can't do anything to harm anybody. Because at the end of that, we've used this tiny amount of violence in order to subdue that person. But even if we did act harshly and bring it into his life, still that's one person dead or one person incapacitated, and the other 11 people, that you and your friends and the bus driver, all of you are able now to live. And so we have protected human life by using violence to subdue this one individual. Isn't that more consistent with the premise that human life is valuable? That seems to be the contradiction there. If human life is valuable, then why not use means up into and even including violent means to protect it? So that's the objection to pacifism, the logical objection. But I also want us to see how pacifism works at this point. I also want us to notice how this works. In pacifism, you've got a person who is being oppressed, the oppressed. And then you have the oppressor, which, whether they're more in number or more in political influence or have better resources, the oppressor is able to oppress the oppressed. Now, in that situation, pacifism would commend us, if we were the ones being oppressed, it would commend us to using nonviolent means in order to convince our oppressor to change his ways. Now, if as we talked about with Martin Luther King doing that, he was a member of the oppressed, and the oppressors were all around him. They were hurting him. They were oppressing him, taking away rights, physically abusing, and this sort of thing. How did he get them to change? Do you remember that? Well, he got them to change because he appealed to a third party. There's a third group involved with pacifism. It's not just the oppressed and the oppressor. The oppressed, instead of appealing to the oppressor, appeals to society, in Martin Luther King's case, to a larger segment of society than those who are oppressing them. And in this case, it was the collective conscience of the rest of the United States, who initially had not been privileged to see what was going on in the South in America, in the South in the United States, but now because of television, now because of these protests, which had been violently put down, now because they are seeing this on the 6 o'clock news, the rest of America gets involved, and the rest of America is bigger than the oppressor. So you've got the oppressed the oppressor, and then in this case, the rest of America. And the only reason that the oppressor changed their ways was not out of the goodness of their own heart. It was not because they were convinced by rational arguments and moral proclamations. The reason that the oppressed changed their tune, and changed their ways was because the whole of America, which was bigger than the oppressor, said, hey, look, you better change your ways. We're making laws so that you need to change your ways. And so there was a force that was larger than the oppressor that made sure that the oppressor changed their ways and stopped oppressing the oppressed. Now notice this, though. Notice this very, very carefully. If the oppressor had not been in some way, shape, or form afraid of or intimidated by the society at large, it never would have stopped the oppression. It never would have stopped the oppression. Let's move from this example to another one that I think might be a little bit more obvious of how this plays out. World War II, we have the Jewish people who are the oppressed. We have the Nazis who are engaging in a systematic extermination of the Jewish people. They are the oppressors. And then we have the Allied forces who are the force that the Jewish people are appealing to in order to get the oppression ceased. What happened when Nazi Germany was not afraid of the Allied people? Well, they continued in their systematic extermination of the Jews. And had there not been a war fought, had there not been, notice what we're saying here, had there not been violent means enacted upon the oppressor, then the oppressed would likely be extinct today, at least in that area of the world. And so pacifism depends on an implicit threat of violence from the larger body to the oppressor. Did you get that? The success of pacifistic ways of dealing with conflict non-violently, in many cases depends upon there being a threat of violence sort of between a second and third party. Now, the pacifist doesn't get their hands dirty with violence, but there is a threat of violence in order to impose upon the oppressor that motivates the oppressor. That's how pacifism works. And so one might sit back and conclude, well, if pacifism makes use of a secondary agent who is threatening violence, then is pacifism actually pacifism? Or is it just sort of a desire not to implicate oneself in physical violence? Anyway, good questions to think about, good questions to consider, especially if you are a pacifist or if you identify yourself as a pacifist. It's not a bad position to take, but many would say that it demands an explanation of how pacifism could work without this threat of violence, and if human life is so valuable, then should we not use violent means to protect it? Because that would be a more effective way than just simply bargaining with the enemy. All right, so we've looked at realism. We've looked at pacifism. Now we come to the third view. The third view is known as just war theory. Just war theory. In just war theory is the idea that the use of force, including military force, is justified in limited and specific circumstances. In other words, we may be justified in using force. We may be justified in using military force, even violence, even killing. So let's see how this sort of works here. Just war theory works off of two sets of criteria. The first set of criteria judges whether or not we have a good reason to be involved in war, whether or not we should go to war. And then the second criteria judges whether or not, assumes that when we're in war, it says, while we're conducting warfare, there is a just way to conduct warfare, and an unjust way to conduct warfare. So this first set of criteria is known as jus ad bellum, and jus ad bellum means justness while going into war. So justice toward war, or rather criteria that we must pass before we allow ourselves to be involved in a military conflict. That's jus ad bellum. Now the other one is jus in bello, which means justness while in war. Justness while engaged in war. Jus in bello are a set of criteria that says while we are engaged in a military conflict, these are some rules of engagement, if you will, while we're fighting the fight. All right, so jus ad bellum, justness while going into war. Jus in bello, justness while in war, engaged in war. All right, let's take a look at some of these criteria. For jus ad bellum, the justness while going into war, the first criteria is that of just cause. Just cause. And basically, this is the idea that if we're going to be involved in a military conflict, we need a good reason for doing so. It's not just that we want to go and expand our beachfront, so we're going to go take over the whole entire west coast of Mexico and Canada. So we want to expand our beachfront property. That would be a terrible reason for going into war. So just war theory demands that we have a just cause for going into war. But what is a just cause? What is a just cause? How do we determine that? What are some things that people have proposed as a good reason for going to war in the past? Certainly one that comes to mind in the very first is self-defense. If we are invaded by somebody, then it is good and proper and just to protect ourselves, to protect our interest. In order to, in doing so, we must sometimes use violence. Think of the Japanese during Pearl Harbor. The Japanese came and they bombed Pearl Harbor during World War II, rather. And America, up till that point, had been sort of a policy of isolationism. Yes, there were some economic sanctions that we enacted against Japan, but we never did any sort of military action toward them up until that point. When they invaded Pearl Harbor, though, that sort of ignited the resolve of the Americans, who then sort of got involved in a total war, basically, where every segment of society was involved in engaging in warfare. So defense of oneself and defense of one's own, against a foreign enemy or an attacker, that certainly would be qualify, I think, as just cause for going into war. Another one has been given is intervening in order to prevent another nation from harming its own population. Of course, we've seen a little bit of that more recently in the news, or at least something appealed to as that, as it seems that Syria might have attacked its own civilians. Of course, Syria has been involved in its civil war for a number of years now. But here recently, the United States intervened when it was believed that the Syrian army had used lethal weapons against citizens, non-combatant citizens within its own territory. And so we went and bombed an airstrip, I guess. But intervening in order to prevent another nation from harming its own population. Now, that one's a little bit more debatable, right? That one's debatable. On the one hand, you might say, well, the United States, we can't sit back and let somebody violate human rights like that, and that might be one position. But on the other hand, the other position might argue, well, whose business is it of ours to intervene in the affairs of another nation, so long as they're not trying to harm us or harm our interests or threatening any of our allies? I mean, they're killing their own people. Fine, so be it. They're a sovereign nation. Let them do that. Why do we need to put American lives at stake to stop that? And so there's an ongoing debate there, right? So, but that might be another one that qualifies for just cause. In the past, some of the reasons that have been used that we need to intervene in this conflict in order to stop the spread of communism, or we need to intervene in this conflict in order to depose a despotic leader, or we need to prevent a country from getting obtaining weapons of mass destruction, or we need to protect the world's oil supply, or we need to have a preemptive strike, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And the question is that when we're going with the criteria of just cause, what exactly counts as just cause, a just cause? So that's that's always a matter for debate. I think the only one that would really be clear is that of self-defense. And that, by the way, sort of plays out in our own personal lives as well, right? One such principle that some people have used in order to say, okay, that violence is never justified except when someone threatens you. So when someone enacts violence or threatens violence to you, you have the justification for returning violence for violence. Right, so you can come back at them and be violent that way. But if somebody is threatening you, or if somebody's just making fun of you with words, or just doesn't like you and is expressing their opinion about that, you don't have the right to use violence when someone has not been violent toward you. That would be a principle there. But just cause is a criteria that just war theory must be met in just war theory. Another criteria is that of legitimate authority. Legitimate authority, and this criteria basically says that only that recognized governmental body within a nation, only that the body which is recognized can, in fact, declare war. So, for example, if the U.S. Army, if a general in the U.S. Army decides, you know what, we need to go to war against such and such country, and they go and they invade that country on their own, that would be an unjust war, and we would have to send our own troops to fight our own troops to get our troops out of there, right? Because the proper authority had not been followed. If somebody goes rogue and acts on their own pretense there, in the United States, the U.S. Constitution authorizes Congress to have the authority to declare war, and only Congress. The President of the United States cannot do that. Cannot declare war. Now, the President does have certain powers over the military as the Commander-in-Chief, and can order what might be known as a police action or something of that nature, but they cannot declare war, which is kind of interesting. Because in our own nation's history, do you know when the last time that Congress actually declared war was? The last declaration of war. Now think about all the conflicts of the 20th century and even before. You've got all of the ones here recently in Iraq and Afghanistan. You've got in the late 90s, or early 90s rather, Desert Storm, where we were in Iraq. You've got the Korean War. You've got the Vietnam War. You've got all kinds of little police actions and military conflicts that go on in between. Then going all the way back to World War II. And World War II was the last time that Congress actually declared war in the United States. Everything that's been done since then has not been a declared war by Congress. It's always been a police action or, some such thing. To many people, that seems to be scandalous. That seems to be sort of it certainly stretches the idea that Congress, as the legitimate authority, has sole governance over when to declare war. But that is another criteria of just war theory, legitimate authority. Only the recognized body within a government can declare war. Another criteria of just war theory is that of proportionality. And proportionality basically proportionality, you got to be careful here because it's a criteria that is in both jus ad bellum and jus in bello. But the idea here of proportionality as it relates to jus ad bellum is that the probable good that is expected to be produced by going into war and by intervening here must outweigh the likely evil that the war will cause. Now, let's face it, war is a bad thing. It's a terrible thing. It's an evil thing. Bad things happen during war. Now, that's, excuse me, That's not to say that nothing good is ever accomplished by war. That's not at all to say that. But even when good is accomplished, there's still a terrible tragedies that take place during war. Now, proportionality, the criteria of proportionality says basically that before we go to war, we need to expect that whatever war, horrors that this war is going to create must be counterbalanced, or rather offset, by the amount of good that we hope to establish or accomplish here. This is obviously a this is obviously a utilitarian aspect to just war theory, and it's also incredibly difficult to determine because honestly, when we go into a war, we have some amount of army intelligence or military intelligence, but we can never really know what the outcome is going to be, right? So many factors affect it that we don't really know exactly how it's going to play out. And so this is an incredibly difficult one to consider as well, but proportionality is one of them. If you think of all the possible goods that can be accomplished, that war can actually accomplish saving lives. We know that it takes lives, but we also know that if it's accomplished in taken care of in a good way, that it can save lives as well. You can see tyranny collapse. You can see freedoms established. You can see financially beneficial treaties established, and so forth. As a result of war, certainly the possible evils might include lives that are lost or infrastructure that is destroyed. Then there's the whole idea of financial rebuilding burden. The burden of rebuilding and the financial burden that would imply. And then let's just face it, war scars lives, even for those who survive. Even for those who survive, they're never quite the same. We hear of the epidemic of PTSD even among our own troops, and the statistic that 31 of them every day in their life themselves choose to end their lives because of PTSD. I mean, it's a horrible thing. It's an absolutely terrible thing. And so there are evils that come as a result of warfare as well. So proportionality, the probable good outweighing the probable evil. And then the fourth criteria of just war theory is that of last resort. And simply put, warfare should be the last resort. We should try to do things, diplomatic solutions first. We should attempt economic sanctions or threats or leveraging allies or boycotts, negotiations, whatever it takes. We should try to engage in peaceful means of reconciliation or resolving the conflict before we ever resort to war. It should be a last resort. And then the fifth and last criteria of jus ad bellum is that of right intention. Right intention, and basically what this says, this is kind of related to just cause, but basically this says if we get into warfare, we need to make sure that that our goal engaging in this warfare is to establish peace. It's not to expand our territory. It's not to to set up a puppet government. It's not any of that sort of thing. It's not to make allies against the communists or whatever else might be imagined. The goal is to establish peace. We get in, we establish peace, and we provide for a maintained peace. That is the idea of right intention. We should not go into it expecting to continue in a continued state of warfare. That would be the criteria of right intention. So that's jus ad bellum. Jus ad bellum. The various criteria there. You've got just cause, legitimate authority, proportionality, last resort. Right intention, the five criteria of just cause or jus ad bellum. Now, jus in bello is the idea of justice while engaged in conflict. And so let's say, for the sake of argument, that we have met all the criteria in a particular conflict of jus ad bellum. We have we have the right cause. The legitimate authority in our country has declared war. We reason that yes, if we go in and intervene in this particular situation, that the likely good will outweigh the evil. We've tried every possible sanction, every possible diplomatic solution already, and we do genuinely desire peace in the area, and we're going to go to war now. We have good reasons to go into war. Now what? Now what do we do? Well, while we're in war, it's not just like the realists. Do whatever it takes in order to win. Just war theory says that while we're engaged in war, there are criteria that we must meet in order to say that we are doing this justly, that we are justly engaged in war. The first one that we'll see is that of proportionality. Now, this is the same in name as the criteria of jus ad bellum. But it means something a little bit differently. It means something a little bit different, rather. In jus in bello, proportionality means this. While we're in the middle of the conflict, violence should be focused on limited objectives, and the violence should be attenuated so that we don't do anything more than to accomplish those objectives. So the idea here is that while we could go in and just obliterate the entire area, drop a nuke on it, the doctrine of proportionality in jus in bello says we may not want to do that because there may be citizens, non-combatant citizens that are around there, and we don't want to destroy or kill them because we do that, and what happens? We do that, and that inspires our enemy against us, right? So we need to go for specific targets, military targets, specific production targets. Maybe it's a manufacturer producing tanks or bombs or whatever, or jeeps or things like that. So we need to target very specific targets with specific amounts of force in order to accomplish our objectives, but not just totally eradicate the entire area. So we gear our use of violence to the proportion of the goals that we intend to achieve. That's what the doctrine of proportionality means in jus in bello. And then there's the doctrine of discrimination. The doctrine of discrimination says this. It says that military action should be used against military targets only. It says that it is unjust to intentionally attack non-combatant and non-military targets. Now let's be very careful with this term non-combatant. In war and in times of war, we generally think of things in terms of the innocents involved. So if we don't bomb the city because there'll be many innocents that are killed, but what exactly is an innocent? A friend of mine who went to Iraq for a year said when he came back, we had a good talk. And he mentioned to me that while he was over in Iraq, like the first engagement that he was involved with there involved a 15-year-old boy who attacked their caravan with an AK-47. A 15-year-old boy. Would we call that 15-year-old boy an innocent? He's shooting at you with an AK-47 with a high-powered rifle. Is that boy an innocent? Is he a guilty? Well, as it turned out, what had happened is that boy had been promised by a local warlord that if he went and did this, that no matter what happened, if he got away or if he died while in action, while shooting and doing this local warlord says, look, I'll take care of your family. Now tell me, is that boy innocent? He wasn't wrapped up in sort of the radical cause that this warlord was. He probably didn't. He wasn't doing it for the glory of Allah or even to get 70 virgins. He was doing it because he wanted to put food on his family's table. He was doing it because he wanted to put clothes on their back. He was doing that in order to provide for his family. Now, is it a good reason or not? Well, it doesn't really matter, and you're not stopping to interview him while he's shooting a gun at you. So whether he's innocent or whether he's guilty or whatever reason he has for shooting a gun at you, if he is involved in a military action against you, that person is a combatant. And the criteria of of discrimination says that we direct our use of violence toward military targets and combatants. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter what age they are. If they're pose a threat to us or our allies, we direct the use of violence toward that combatant. Another problem with discrimination is that sometimes it can be hard to tell. Another friend of mine who was a combat medic in Vietnam, he came back and he wrote a book about his experiences over there. And he has a part in one of his chapters about this about some of the negative publicity that the Vietnam War was getting at the time. And reporters would go over there and they would stand in the battle lines and they would take pictures of U.S. Servicemen and engaged in conflict and combat, and they would be shooting and killing people. And one particular tactic that was used oftentimes is they would go and they would take videotapes of times where American bombers had bombed out Vietnamese hospitals, field hospitals, like in villages and things like that, in the enemy encampments. Well, what had happened, and they would say, look at how evil the Americans are because they're bombing our hospitals. Look at how terrible they are. Well, what actually was happening in those situations, and it was true, the hospitals were being bombed left and right. But what had happened during those situations was this, as it sort of turns out, the Viet Cong, which were the North Vietnamese, the enemy of the United States and the South Vietnam at that point, the Viet Cong had a tactic that when they expected that they were going to be attacked by the Americans, they knew that the Americans had planes, had air superiority, and they would fly through and they would bomb the base. And one of the first places that they would bomb would be whatever they believed to be the munitions dump. That's where they kept all the ammunition and the bombs and the mortar shells and everything. That would be the first place to bomb for a couple of reasons, right? One, it disarms your enemy, but two, it also creates a really big explosion in the middle of their camp if you bomb it. So that would be one of the first places that they would bomb. So what the Viet Cong started doing was that they would take the big red cross off the top of the hospital tent and they would move it over to the munitions dump tent, so that when the American planes flew over, they would bomb all the other tents except for where the big red cross was, because the Viet Cong knew that the Americans don't bomb hospitals, and so they made the ammo dump tent to look like a hospital. So that the Americans would not attack it. So in any case, that was a tactic employed by the enemy in order to not only keep their weapons and ammunition, but also to spread sort of negative publicity about the war and create tensions about the war back here in the United States, create a negative sort of propaganda. And that was going on. So the criterion of discrimination sometimes can be very difficult. Sometimes can be a very difficult thing because of the tactics of the military, because of also the tactics of the enemy, because of also just the people who are involved in who are combatants aren't always committed to the ideological cause of the enemy. But nonetheless, the tactic or the criterion of discrimination in just war theory needs to be followed. We need to discriminate between a military target and that of that which is a non-violent or a civilian non-combatant situation as well. So there's the doctrine or the criterion of proportionality, the criterion of discrimination, and one last thing was the criterion of intrinsically evil means. The criterion of intrinsically evil means. Now, what this is the criterion of intrinsically evil means is the idea that there are some tactics, some methodologies, some ways of conducting warfare out there that are so bad that just because they are what they are, they should never be used. We should never use these particular ones. We think of things like the atomic bomb. Okay, that would be one that some people would say would be a weapon of intrinsically evil means. So the idea there is that we should never use the atomic bomb whenever we're engaged in warfare, because as soon as we do, we are no better than the enemy himself. Because think about how an atomic bomb works, right? So you've got a military plant, and yeah, you're going to blow that military plant up, but really the atomic bomb is used for all of the collateral damage. When we bombed, say, Nagasaki, during the Second World War. The bomb that fell on Nagasaki. Now, Nagasaki was a port city. It was a city where city where lots of manufacturing took place. It was a city where they were manufacturing the war machine, right, and then like exporting it so that they could go and fight the war. So they would build planes, they would build tanks and transport vehicles and so forth. So Nagasaki, in one sense, was a military target. We blow that place up, they're not going to be able to manufacture planes in order to fight us. But on the other hand, Nagasaki was also was home to many thousands of citizens who, hundreds of thousands of citizens, who may not have been involved in the war effort at all. And so bombing Nagasaki not only resulted in the destruction of a military target, also it included the destruction and the deaths of children and people who are not even involved in the war, who are certainly non-combatants, who at the very most may have played a support role. But nonetheless, some people look at that and say, because of all of the widespread collateral damage that atomic bombs always cause, and because of the almost irreparable damage to the environment that they do, that they are an intrinsically evil means that we should never make use of them in warfare. That's debatable, of course. People can take the other side and say, you know what? You know how many lives were saved because we bombed Nagasaki? Yes. We killed so many, that resulted in the deaths of so many people, people who are non-combatants, people who were not involved in the war effort. But do you realize how many people were saved because after Nagasaki, the will of the Japanese to fight and continue to fight in World War II was absolutely shattered. They were done. They said no more. And we did not have to attempt a ground assault into Japan, which would have been disastrous for us. It would have been disastrous for them. It would have been a war of attrition where several hundred thousands, if not millions, may have lost their lives. And so it prevented a war. It prevented a land invasion. Therefore, it was worth it, right? Well, that's the debate. That's the debate. That's the tension that when we're looking into these things. Other so-called intrinsically evil means of warfare might include things like looting. So the idea that once the army goes in there and destroys everybody, that they just have free reign to take and pillage everything that they want. That's sort of a bad taste in the mouth of the locals. And another would be terrorism. Attacking non-combatants for the sake of terrorizing those who are combatants, trying to cow them into quitting the fight. Another one might be the use of torture or so-called enhanced interrogation procedures, techniques. Now, the idea that would be intrinsically evil because here you're taking someone who can't harm you, and you're bringing pain and inflicting pain on them. That would be intrinsically evil. Others point to things like biological warfare and the use of toxins or gas. Poison gas, things like this. All of these things are intrinsically evil means of warfare, and because they're intrinsically evil, we should just not do them. We should take the moral high ground and not employ them whenever engaging in warfare. So those are some of the those are some of the criteria of jus ad bellum and jus in bello. For jus in bello, the doctrine of proportionality, for discrimination, and for intrinsically evil means. Those are all things that we need to take into consideration when we engage in warfare. Those are them. Anyhow, what I would like for you to do after this, after listening to this lecture and after reading, is make sure not to forget to take the quiz. Also, there's a discussion board open. It's not going to be graded, but if you have any questions over this particular lecture or over any of the topics presented in it that you would like clarified, don't hesitate to post that in there. Or if you just want to engage with other students and say, hey, I'm a pacifist, so here's how I would deal with the objections that were raised against pacifism. Or, hey, I'm a realist, but I don't advocate certain things, or whatever you want to say, whatever sort of a conversation on the topic that you want to be involved in, go ahead and post in that forum. Use that forum as a media to express your views there. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I will endeavor to see you back in class next time, and we will continue from there. Have a great week. Bye-bye.